Okay, good evening, everybody. We are about to begin, so please take this moment to silence your cell phones. And I welcome you all to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. My name is Amanda Leiden, and as curator of our evening event series, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's Back in the Days remix presentation with Jamel Shabazz. Last night at our Snapshot event, visitors had the opportunity to take photos inside our historic tenement. They were grateful for the experience to look at the museum with a photographer's lens. It was the third time we hosted this kind of event. The first Snapshot was inspired by the launch of our archive of digital photos. Our collection includes photos from our building and of the Lower East Side from all kinds of sources. In fact, Jamel Shabazz has offered some of his photos for our collection. Our Director of Curatorial Affairs likes to remind us that when looking at photos of a neighborhood, the photographer matters. There's a different editorial eye. So you get a different story when you're looking at photos of Jacob Reese, someone's mom, Rebecca Lepkoff, Edmund Gillen, the New York Police Department, or Jamel Shabazz. Jamel is here tonight to celebrate the 10th anniversary and the new edition of Back in the Days. He dedicates the new edition to everyone that stood before his lens and allowed him to record their history. Please join me in welcoming Jamel Shabazz.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'd like to take this opportunity and to extend my sincere thanks and appreciation to the Tenement Museum for affording me the opportunity to show my work here. This area is so important to me because back in the days, matter of fact, before I picked up the camera as a young child, I was shot on Delancey Street, at 14, 15 years old. It was always a pleasure, and I gained such a wealth of knowledge being in this area. A lot of the store merchants were Jews from the Holocaust survivors, and it helped me to understand the beauty of life. And a lot of those old merchants, they would engage me in conversation and encourage me. I never forgot them, and I regret not having a photograph of them here. But that's one of the images I definitely want to donate to this institution, because I'll never forget seeing the tattoos on their arms and knowing they were survivors from the camps and they were store merchants at the same time. So this area, again, is so dear to me. I would spend really 35 years of my life down here, coming here often, both shopping and shooting. So it's an honor to be here. And this particular photograph right here is important because it was shot right on Delancey Street back in the early 80s, where a lot of young guys came to pick up their clothes at a very inexpensive price. I'd like to thank powerHouse, my publisher, Craig Cohen, for believing in me. It's due to Craig that I have this book out back in the days. It started from a conversation with one of my partners in the locker room where I worked as a correction officer, and he was from my generation, and we always talk about back in the days and how much it was a better time. So from that idea, from that conversation, I decided to bring my books out, and powerHouse believed in me and was able to produce this book over 10 years ago. So I'm here to share my vision with you. So I call all of these images here pretty much seconds of my life. They all represent pieces of the puzzle of my life, and I'm so thankful for having the ability to see and having an opportunity to meet so many wonderful people throughout my travels. The camera has been a part of my life for over 35 years, and I never leave home without it. And what it has done for me, it has opened up so many doors within communities for me to meet people. And these few images pretty much represent that. So any inquiries you have regarding the images that you saw, I break down the history and what it means to me. But every photograph is very important. I started out, for the most part, just wanting to have a visual diary of my experience. And the camera became that tool that allowed me to do that. But this is so much going back into my life. I mean, it's a lot. One of the things that really inspired me was this book here. This book has played such an important role in my life coming up as a young child. And it shows you the power of having books around the house. My father, who was a professional photographer in the 1950s while in the military, the Navy, had this book on the coffee table. It was a signed copy. And it blew me away as a young child seeing this book here. And I would go through it so much, it practically fell apart. But not only was I digesting the images, I was also reading the text. And through reading the words of Leonard Freed, it gave me a lot of insight on the African-American experience in America back in the 1960s. And it stayed with me for so long. As time would go on, I would mirror a lot of these images in my most recent work subconsciously. So I owe so much to Leonard Freed. I never had an opportunity to meet him, but I did meet his wife, and she had an opportunity to really tell me, the whole process behind his images. And so many of the photographs in this book are going to be a part of my life. And this picture here was taken in West Germany back in the 1960s. And 10 years later, I'll say about maybe 15 years later, I would find myself in West Germany also as a soldier, understanding what was going through this soldier's mind at that time. And also, some 30 years later, I would find myself working as a correctional officer in prison, seeing this image pretty much every day played out. So it's very interesting how this book would impact my life in so many different ways. So here I am now, 8 years retired from the law enforcement community. I worked as a correctional officer for 20 years, and that job really gave me the fortitude to do what I'm doing right now, because I worked in an atmosphere where a lot of young men were at a crossroads in their lives, and being a correctional officer allowed me to engage them. Some of these young men I would see in the streets, prior to the incarceration, and I tried to guide them at that point. So that's when my life is over. It's just a whole lot. I'm 50 years old. I'm trying to find out, where should I begin? Should I begin now and go back, or should I go back and move forward? But I think I'll go back and move forward. I'll go back into the 60s and 70s, which is very important to understand. I'll bring you up to date. But going back to Lynn Freed's book, which is the 1960s, I'm a young child, 8 or 9 years old. The Vietnam War is going on at that time, and the images of war are being played on television every day. And I'm digesting the horrors of war. As a young child, I'm going to the barbershop, there's Life magazines there. And I'm picking up these Life magazines, seeing images of war and destruction. And I was going to really hate war, despite even going in the military. But images of Vietnam really stayed in my mind. I couldn't understand it. Both the war itself, the protests that were going on in this country, and even the civil rights. Looking at what was going on in the South, and being pained by the suffering that was happening. But I also saw the power of images, and how these images help you to understand what was going on around the world. So photography was so important to me at that time. I always looked to learn as much as I could. I would spend hours in the library studying magazines, both nationally and internationally, trying to get a broader understanding on world politics. And it's through those images that really inspired me in so many different ways to just want to learn about different cultures. At around 15 years old, as I was trying to find my way, I started off as a graffiti artist like a lot of my peers, and I wasn't too good at it. I was left-handed, and for whatever reason, I would always get the ink on my hands, so that just wasn't working. They were great, and they would give me a shot and just write my name for me, because they knew I was struggle. And I remember we had a little gang problem coming up, and it was a big thing in Brooklyn, where I was raised at. And I had a friend who was a really good guy, Winston. And Winston kept me in line. Whatever reason, he was razor sharp. His mother was a nurse, he was professional, and he was a really good kid. I liked being around him. And during one of my travels with Winston, he took me to his cousin's home in Brooklyn also, and his cousin happened to be the warlord of a gang called the Jolly Stompers. The Jolly Stompers was one of the most notorious gangs in Brooklyn at that time. They pretty much came out of Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And with his cousin being a warlord, that's a key position in the game, because as a warlord, you are instructed to fight the other gang. When the two gangs meet on the battlefield, it's the warlords that come out first. And they're normally the baddest ones within inside the gang. And Cornell happened to be that gangbanger. It was Cornell, his name was Sundance, and the president at that time, his name was Butch. So you had Butch and Sundance. So luckily, Winston was my best friend, my good friend, brought me to Cornell's house, and I saw another side of Cornell. He was a very compassionate person, despite having this title as warlord. But what was unique about Cornell was two things I gained from him. He had a stereo equipment. I remember going into his home and hearing Kool and the Gang. And it was something about Kool and the Gang. It's like, wow, this is some deep music here. And I always associate Kool and the Gang Jungle Boogie to the theme song, the Jolly Stompers chant. And they loved Kool and the Gang for whatever reason. But besides that, Cornell had these big, thick photo albums that looked like yellow pages. And they were photographs that he had made of the gang. And they were some of the most dignified photographs I've ever seen before, of young teenagers that were standing pretty much erect, but they were serious guys. And I looked at those images and I said, man, one day I'm going to take photographs just like that. But these are some serious pictures right here. I've never seen anything like it before in my life. Despite seeing the work of Leonard Freed, it was something about these photographs of my neighborhood, the people I would see, that really stayed with me. So after seeing those photographs, I said to myself, I want to be a photographer. And I went home and I snatched up my mother's 110 camera and I went out to start my own journey. And what I pretty much saw in those albums were guys dressed like this. This is a beaver hat, and it's like crews of guys. We're talking about like 10, 15 guys, all dressed with leathers on and sharkskin pants and Playboy shoes with beaver hats on. I'm like, man, I want pictures just like that. So I took my mother's camera, snatched it up from her, because she had a little camera with the ice cubes. And then for you guys over 50 years old, even people a little bit younger, you can relate to these two cameras that I would use that she had around the house. My father wasn't going to let me take his Nikon out. So I snatched up the Kodak 126 and Kodak 110. And I was going on my photographic mission to try to make images that would mirror Cornell's images. And I actually did. And I started off my high school. I regret not having some of those photographs with me now. But 1975 started that journey. And I found there was instant magic when I had my camera and I approached people. It gave me a voice. I was a young man at that time. I studied. So my ability to articulate really wasn't that great at that time. But I knew how to tell women they were beautiful. There was something about saying that had them just open. I said, well, I got something going on here. Can I take your picture? Well, why do you want my picture for? Because you're so beautiful. And I made the picture. And I said, you give me your phone number, I'll make sure you get a copy. It was some magic with the camera. I don't tell everybody that now. Next thing I know, everybody started having cameras. But it's interesting back then, coming up as a photographer, what I would do with my friends. This is one of the reasons why I did my book also. Very important. And it's something I have to go on. Before I go on further, I have to say that these photographs on this first page of my book, A Time Before Crack, are the images I made in the 1970s. I wish they were larger. But these pictures are pretty much made with a 110 to 126 camera at my junior high school when I was about 15, 16 years old. And what we would do back then, when I was short on money, I would go to my partners and say, you know what? I want to take some pictures of you guys. I need to just raise some money between everybody. You know, you donate for some film, I'll make sure you get copies of the photographs. So we were throwing our quarters in it, and I would get film. And then what I would do, I'll make sure I get photographs of them. Then I'll go to back in those days, we went to the local drugstore to get our photographs processed. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But back in the days, you went to the drugstore, and they would make these cheap prints, but I was happy with that. And it might have cost about $5 to get done. I would go to my partner and say, you know, I got to raise money to get these pictures out the shop. They would donate money again. So a lot of the work a lot of my images really belong to my peers because they donated for the whole process. So I felt the need to put the books out for them because they were part of this here. So that's that particular part. Then as time went on, at the age of 17, my mother and father divorced. Because I have to say this, my father was a photographer and my mother was a nurse. Through my father, I learned photography. Through my mother, I learned compassion. So I took those two elements and became a part of my character as I would make my journey. But 1976, they went through a divorce. And that divorce really changed my whole life around. Through that divorce, I took to the street. I dropped out of high school. And I would leave my class, and I would go to classes that interest me. Pretty much his classes on history and psychology, but I never got credit for it. Then eventually I dropped out altogether, and I would just go hang out in the local library. And there was no safety nets around. There was no one there to really guide me on the right path. So the Army recruiter came around, and he sold me a dream. And in a sense, that dream was good. And the war in Vietnam had just ended. So it was a very interesting time to go into the military. I was 16 years old at the time, so I had to wait till my 17th birthday to join. So on July 13, 1977, the day of the blackout, I turned 17, and I was able to go into the military, and I would start a whole other journey in my life. And I would go on to spend 3 years of my life in Germany, and that was my rites of passage. And through being in Germany, I developed a great appreciation for photography, life, people. Germany I'm 17 years old, and I'm placed in a very interesting atmosphere. You know, only thing I really brought with me was my love letters, and matter of fact, my love letters came when I was in Germany. That's a whole other story. But it was these photographs that I would take with me when I would go out in the field on maneuvers, and I would use the moonlight to look at these images to remind me of home. And you know, because we would get homesick, but these photographs kept me strong. And I promised myself when those cold, because Germany is cold. And when you're in the military, we spend I was infantry, so we stayed in the field a lot. And it was very, very miserable. And a lot of my peers fell victims to heroin over there. Nobody really understands. It's a very important part, a very important history that's important to me because it helps to understand what made me the person I was when I returned from the service. But the heroin epidemic was heavy in Germany back in the 1970s. At that time, it was stated that the Russians were bringing it, they were pushing it into the military bases to break down, you know, the fighting ability of the American soldier. So a lot of soldiers were dropping dead off snorting heroin, and I witnessed this here. And luckily I hooked up with a friend of mine who actually enhanced my photography skills and taught me how to play chess. And he didn't smoke, he didn't drink, all he did was study, play chess, and take photographs. So I latched on to him, and he became like a safety net for me when I was in the military. So I would do my 3 years, complete schooling in, I would finish high school in the military, take on college courses, and I returned back to the States in 1980, the summer of 1980. I came home a changed man. I'm now 20 years old with a vision. I purchased a Canon AE1 camera while I was in the service. I was introduced to, matter of fact, before I come back from Germany, I was given other gifts. Because back then we didn't have computers. What was important to us was our stereo equipment. So while in Germany, I racked up on my stereo equipment. So this page right here, I call the Kingdom, represents my room when I came home. And I racked up on stereo. I got turned on the music back in the days. And it was a joy. You know, one of the things that we did, this is how I got high. I would go, I said, I'm going to make me a reel-to-reel. So I would go to all my partners. I'm in Germany. I would knock on the room. So I'm making me a reel-to-reel. I'm going to borrow some albums. So I would go to their rooms and just borrow albums from different people, from different soldiers from around the whole country. So from that experience, I got turned on to salsa, reggae, jazz, classical, R&B music, and all types of music I would make my reel-to-reels on. And that was a high for me. So music became a very important part of my life, especially jazz and reggae music when I was in the Army. So now I ETS, I returned back to the States, and I'm a changed person. I come home to a whole different world now. The blackout of 1977 really was a bad thing. You know, of course, what it did, it changed people. A lot of the fashion came out of the blackout. People really don't know about that. And a lot of guns came out of the blackout because a lot of bad things was happening. So that 3 years I was gone, I returned, and a lot had happened. Some of my friends have lost their little brothers to violence. Practically every one of my peers has lost their little brother to violence. My brother was the only one to survive. And it's interesting because my brother took pictures and he played chess and he listened to music. He survived, but all of his peers, they all got murdered in the street. So I came home to this and I said, something has to change here. So being I was out of the service, I had saved up enough money to live for about 6 months. I went back into my neighborhood and I started to engage young people, starting off at my local high school. So a lot of the photographs that you see in my book are pretty much, they're made at 2 high schools in my community. One high school was called Samuel J. Tilden, which is about 5 blocks away, a school in which I attended. And I would spend my daytime, during the morning I would go there when school was starting. And I would just confront young men and say, look, I used to go to this school here, you know, and I dropped out. It is very important that you understand the importance of education and staying in school. I said, and with that, may I take a photograph of you? You know, my name is Jamel Shabazz. A lot of them knew me from seeing me in the neighborhood, so they all welcomed me with open arms. And I just started to become like a mentor to a lot of these young children because I didn't want them to end up like me. So they all took to me. So a lot of the photographs that you see are high school students. And I always took time to encourage them. I would bring the chessboard and teach them chess and say, chess, understanding this game will help you understand how to deal with conflict resolution. It would help you understand the importance of sacrifice and struggle and decision making. So that was one of the gifts I gave young people. I would bring young men to my home and young women to my home and turn them on to jazz music. Then I had my Bose speakers and my Sansui receiver and my Pioneer reel-to-reel. These kids thought I was rich. You know? And I was jamming my music. I was making mixtapes way back then. Bad mixtapes. I mean, I was turning on some serious music. And I would turn them on to that. And what's interesting during that time, too, an enemy who became a friend gave me a dark room. This is a guy who I didn't like. I had serious conflict with him back in the days. But unbeknownst to me, he was a photographer. And he became my friend. When I came home from the Army and I had my camera, he saw me with it and we developed a friendship with each other. He gave me a mega darkroom and taught me how to develop. So now I'm learning how to develop, and I'm spending hours at night in my darkroom. My father and I, we got close at the time. Despite my mother and father being divorced, I lived with my father. And he was so elated that I was developing and learning how to develop. He taught me the process. I would spend hours in my darkroom. I would go down there with my herb tea, my incense, have my jazz playing, and I would develop all night long. And I fell in love with that aspect of photography. So it's just so much. I can go on and on with this here. But that person who was my enemy being in the darkroom, later on when the crack epidemic came out, he put down his camera and picked up the crack. And he eventually got murdered. You know, he would get shot 7 times in the head in that life. So there's a whole lot to the story. I don't want to be long-winded because I can go on and on and on. But, you know, tonight is not about me, but it's about you. So I'm willing to take any questions that you have, because I don't want to just be too long and bore you. So I'll take any questions that you have. We can talk about it. I just have to say one thing that really every book is important to me, but this book, A Time Before Crack, means a lot, because crack changed everything. Once crack came into the community, practically everyone in these books were affected by it in some form or fashion. So I felt the need to do a book called A Time Before Crack, just to remind people, because sadly so many are gone. I could tell you stories that will blow you away about so many people in this book. Some of them, the most recent person was murdered about maybe a month ago, who's in my book. And I got a phone call from a friend. So much tragedy has happened. So this book is a form of visual medicine to remind my generation of a very different time. So I'll take your questions now, because again, I don't want to be too long, but I want to make sure that I answer every question here. I will not leave until everyone is satisfied. Yes?
You still live in that neighborhood, or have you moved out?
No, I've since moved out. I moved out. My father had passed away, and I moved on. I'm married now. I live in Long Island, and my neighborhood has changed a lot, but I still visit it often. Yes?
There was one picture of a man in a cell, and I heard you say that you were a corrections
Yes.
officer, so I'm wondering if you were allowed, if there were any opportunities for you to take pictures when you were under record.
That's a good question. The camera became, when I first got called for the job, I had my camera with me. So they instantly said, well, this guy's a photographer. The whole entire process, I have my camera. From my physical, the academy, the range, always had it with me, and I always shot. And I knew the psychology. With photography, you got to understand psychology. So when I saw the main chief instructor first, I said, can I take a picture of you? He said, sure, you can take my picture. And he let me take his picture, so I developed a friendship with him. So technically, you weren't allowed to bring the camera to the jail, but my strategy was to shoot all my coworkers, starting with the brass. Oftentimes, a lot of them took a picture before. So I was able to take a photograph of them for the first time in their uniform, so they knew me as the photographer. So they allowed me to bring it in. It was a law that you couldn't, but the fact that I made these beautiful portraits of them, very much like back in the day. I've never even really shown those photographs before, and I gave them to them as a gift, and thus they allowed me to bring my camera in. So I started to document that experience in my life, because again, it was a part of my visual diary. So I have a massive collection of images from prison or jail that I can't even look at, because that was a very painful part of my life. The picture that you saw of the young man in the jail cell, I wanted people to get a feel of what it was to be incarcerated. And oftentimes, I would place myself in the cell and lock the door and just sit there, just to feel the misery, smell the dead rats, to get a feeling of what these people went through. So from that experience, I learned empathy. And I learned there's a lot of people. That cell was a very important cell, too, because that cell, when I worked in the Manhattan courts, I kept that cell clean for special people. But I worked in mental health, and that was a whole nother story, too. But there was a lot of good people who came through the system, and you knew they were good. I used that cell for people who want to pray. So if you want to pray, here's a cell. So don't lose your faith in jail. I'm an officer. I understand the importance of prayer and meditation. You can use the cell for this. For those that didn't want to defecate in the presence of 50 people, here's a clean cell that you can go in, so you can maintain some degree of humanity. And that was a cell that people went home from. So I always wanted to maintain my balance, because to work in that job is a very difficult job, because you're always off balance. You try to go as a righteous person, but it's hard. I read 2 books to maintain my balance. I read The Art of War, and I read The Art of Peace. And I tried to yearn more towards the art of peace. But sometimes you're walking into a war zone. You're walking into a very negative atmosphere. And luckily, I meditated, I prayed, I spent time in the ocean as much as I could, and I took photographs to maintain my balance, because it's a very violent world. I tried to engage both the inmates and my co-workers. As I developed time on the job and experience, I worked the most difficult house on Rikers Island, a house that inmates sing about. To this day, they sing about the Ford building. I worked in that institution. I had the worst of the worst inmates. I was given that area. But I inspired them to read. I inspired them to go to school. I created jobs for them. So rather than being in an atmosphere where you can find all day long, now you can go and you can work and you can make your own money. But it was still a very negative environment. But I try to believe in people. And one of the greatest joys that I get to this very day is when I return, when I walk the street, and a young man might approach me with his wife and his children and say, I remember you, officer. You took care of me. You gave me a book to read. And to this day, I remember what you've done for me. I'll never forget you. I have letters that inmates wrote me that were about to go home. One letter, an inmate had wrote to me, a young man who was a detainee, should I say. He said, you are an angel. He said, I'll never forget you. He just handed that to me. He said, I just want you to have this here. You are an angel. And it kept me focused because you never knew who you were dealing with. Every day I went to work, I looked for good people. I tried to find people who were struggling. You might have been arrested for a parking ticket. You might have had a dispute with your wife. A lot of times you just caught up in a dragnet and you place into a situation, you feel helpless. I try to look at people's hearts. So that job, it gave me back. It was a very difficult job. But fortunately, I had a good wife, and I had my camera, and I had faith. And it allowed me to survive. And again, it's been 8 years. I'm going to my 9th year of retirement, and I feel pretty good. You know, statistics state that you're not supposed to live this long, but for correctional officers, it's really a violent world. It's a violent world. So I survived it. Any other questions? Yes.
You talked about how, the pictures and the story behind them is really important to you.
Yes.
And nowadays, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, there's a little bit of overexposure with all of the cameras and the internet and Facebook and all that. I think maybe a loss of significance to a certain degree. Do you, I just want to know what you think about how things are today, or
it's a beautiful thing. I love it, to be honest with you, because everyone's documenting right now.
Right.
I love digital photography, but now, rather than say, you know what, let me take a picture and I'll have it back for you in 2 days. Now I can say, come check out your picture. And I like it. Yeah, I like it. I mean, that's kind of cool. I can email it to you, so it's great. And yes, people are documenting right now like never before. I'm seeing stuff that, it's like, wow, they shouldn't have took that picture. I'm seeing everybody now got a camera in a mirror. It's like, wow, this is interesting right here. So I understand what you're saying, but it's all good. It's all relevant. Because I always tell people one of the greatest things you can give a person other than knowledge is a camera. So it's good that people are documenting. Because back when I was coming up, a lot of people weren't documenting. That's why they was avoiding images. So everyone has them now. But I feel honored that I was able to document back in the 70s and 80s, and it means a lot. So I encourage people. We all should have cameras, video cameras, document our lives. But have a focus. I stress to young people, document the elders, document your grandparents, your relatives, document the children. Have a vision. It's one thing to have a camera and no vision. You have a vision and camera, you got something special. Yes?
Did you meet the Holocaust survivors in this neighborhood before you were stationed in Germany?
I met them before I was stationed in Germany.
Did that make you sort of look at Germany differently?
Totally. I went, I grew up, for those people over 50, I grew up watching Mike Waller's biography. And that movie really, I watched it all the time. That series that came on every weekend. So I studied world history. I love history. The Holocaust is a very interesting history because, how could people do this to another people? Between the Holocaust, African slave trade. I studied atrocities, whatever it is, in Vietnam, the massacres that took place over there. All the massacres just caught my eye because there's all the images that inspired me. Because I wanted to be a war photographer. So when I met the Holocaust survivors, I knew automatically when I saw that tattoo on his arm what it represented. And he respected me because I knew what it was. These guys were all at the time maybe in their 50s. And I understood that they had survived. So when I went to Germany, I saw what Hitler did. Vividly, I saw the creation of the Aryan nation. I saw how he would take the strong SS men with the women and produce tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed women. I saw that physically in my own eyes. I was in a base that was a former base for the German soldiers. So it was always dormant in my mind, and the soldiers were there. When I saw these old men in their 50s and 60s at that time, I knew they were former German soldiers, and I communicated with them about that. So it helped me to understand. So Germany, my experience on Delancey Street, it helped me to understand suffering. And these men, they were very interesting men. And I developed a relationship with them over the many years of shopping. In a sense, I missed them because, I've been coming here since 1974. And I would see these same men, they would just know me. Hey, picture man. So it was a very interesting journey. Good question. Yes.
How did blackout influence fashion? I heard you say, the blackout. I'm really interested in that.
I want to explain that to you. That's a very interesting question. See, people don't know about that. They never say this on VH1. I want to tell you. How that influenced fashion was, I have to be very real. This is a very painful history, and I don't like talking about it, but this is the only way people understand. You get the person who might have broken into a jewelry store. He got all the rings. So now the next day, you got a guy wearing no rings on his hand. That's one. You got the guy walking around with glasses on with no lenses. Unfortunately, he might have been affiliated with a glass store. He got nice frames, no lenses. You got the guy wearing mismatched sneakers. They have the showcase sneakers, and you got one blue, you got one red. That's one. You got the guys wearing the mismatched t-shirts, the tank tops. The way that is, let me explain that one to you. See, people don't know this, so this is history right here. You got to understand right here. You got the two-tone tank top shirts. There's a science behind that. So you got like the T-top and the tank top. You might have got into a store that had shirts. So you had the T-top and you have the two-tone. You have the red with the white. I'll give you an example of that. So that influenced it. So that's how it influenced fashion. And you had some people that would change their clothes 3, 4, 5 times a day. Why? Because they might have hit a store with a lot of clothes. So I have to be honest with you like that. Even with a lot of, it's a reality. And I didn't feel good about that, but it was a reality that happened. It was an opportunity. It wasn't a good one. And a lot of people suffered behind that. But it was something that happened.